We'll jump right into it. After opening up the panel topic, I'd like to just quickly introduce our panel members and then start by asking each a question to get you all thinking about the things you'd like to know that they know. So as you know, we're the panel 3, Training and Leader Development for Large-Scale Combat Operations, Live, Virtual, and Constructive. And to quote the National Defense Strategy, interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in the U.S. national security. The recently published Army Vision supports that strategy, declaring that the Army of 2028 will be ready to deploy, fight, and win against any adversary, anytime, anywhere, in a joint, multi-domain, high-intensity conflict, while simultaneously deterring others and maintaining its ability to conduct irregular warfare. And that is a tall order. That's not just going to happen. Soldiers have to be trained for those types of missions. As we all know from experience, training is essential for certain victory. During this panel discussion, we'll explore ideas in which the Army and Army Aviation is preparing to fight and win in large-scale combat operations. And today, to share their thoughts with us are, in the order from to my right, is Major General Maria Gervais. She's the Deputy Commanding General for Training at CAC. Also, we have Major General Retired Jeff Schloesser. Jeff's down on the end there, Executive Vice President, Strategic Pursuits for Bell. We have Colonel Bill Ryan, who's the Deputy Commander at Fort Rucker. And we have John Ferrell, who's the Director of Simulations at Fort Rucker. And then, of course, the Chief Warrant Officer of the branch, CW5 Joe Roland. Thank you all for being here today. I'm going to start out by asking General Gervais the first question. Ma'am, how do you foresee the synthetic training environment impacting how we will change the way we train maneuver forces in large-scale combat operations?
Okay, we're in trouble already. If I can't operate this, I'm overseeing the synthetic training environment, so we could be in jeopardy already. So a great question, and it's kind of important that as I answer that question, we kind of talk about, for example, where exactly we are and where we've been, and then why we need to look at this in the future. And I'll just kind of take us a little bit back in time. If we looked at the last 15 plus years, our focus has been elsewhere. I mean, it's been focused in two theaters, focused on the counterinsurgency, COIN environment. And nor have we had to really take a look at how do we ensure that, we maintain a near-peer capability. We haven't really had to think about that since the Cold War, as, time period. So as we've been focused on a counterinsurgency COIN environment, and over the last 15 years, what we've kind of seen is our adversaries have not been standing still. They have been really taking a look, and they've been strengthening their capabilities so that they can really mitigate our strengths. And, they've done that, and we've seen it play out in, in Syria. We've seen it come out of the Mission Command Center of Excellence, Russian New Generation Warfare Study. And, they've been strengthening their integrated air defense capability, their EW, their cyber, their space. And then, as we look to the future, we also got to think about mega cities and how would we operate in a mega city. So over the last 15 years, our focus has been elsewhere. And so as we've taken a look at where do we stand as an Army in terms of our ability to train and what is our capability at our combat training centers, what we determined is we have to really transition from a COIN, a mission rehearsal type environment, to a large-scale combat operations, decisive action training capability, and provide that threat picture or that capability to our training unit, our training audience, so they can train. And so as we took a look at this, we kind of found that there were some things that we had to take some steps to increase the rigor at our combat training centers. And it's good to see Gary's here because, He sat with me when we got the guidance from the chief that said increase rigor, focus on this. And when I came into this job, one of the first things the chief said was, we need to put an integrated air defense capability in place at our combat training centers. We have got to get back to where we will present that picture and that threat to, one, our air crews so we can get them back, with the right TTPs for this contested, degraded environment. Number two, he said, we got to put something out there that's going to challenge us and be able to shoot down 20 to 30 aircraft. So 2 years ago, working with aviation community and actually the entire community at large, from the PEOs, PM Aviation, PEO STRI, also our training testing community, what we found is we could put an integrated air defense capability in place out at our CTCs. It's not perfect, we're bringing capability in, but it is driving the change to our culture, which really we figured started at the CTCs. So we just did an assessment of that, and we're finding that it actually is driving the change in terms of the air crews and how they fly. What we have to do is improve that capability so that we can actually drive the battle staff planning process as part of that. And as we put this together, we wanted to make sure that it was competitive for both the Army, and we could also bring in the Air Force and the Marines to help from the joint perspective. And so we actually took an approach where it was live emitters, and it was also balanced with instrumentation. And so where we sit right now is, we have a capability out of our combat training centers. It's working. We got to improve it, and the Air Force is actually asking us to help improve it because some of their weapon systems and the F-35, they've oversaturated some of their ranges, so we have the ability now to explore some joint funding to bring this in place. So we've made this transition to large-scale combat operations, and we're also bringing in EW Cyber and Space. So we've started with our combat training centers, because that's where we see we can drive change the quickest within the Army. But secondly, where is our gap that we have to improve? And that is our home station training capability. Because, we really need to improve our home station training capability so that, through simulations, so that as they enter into the live environment, they go in at increased proficiency. And to me, that's where I see the synthetic training environment is going to be the most beneficial. Because right now, if you look at our current integrated training environment, we cannot execute all of our warfighting functions. We cannot do it because what we've done is we've taken 1980s and 90s technologies, we've pieced it together with our Mission Command information systems, and we can only do some of it. We cannot do all of it. We can only do live virtual constructive training at 10 locations. So we're limited on where and how we can do it. Synthetic training environment will come in and it will allow for, replicating the operational environment to include megacities, EW, cyber, and space. It will be available at the point of need, which is wherever you need to train on. And we want to provide the terrain so that wherever that terrain you're going to fight on, you can pull that terrain down and have the capability to train on. Now, where we are right now is our 1980, 90s technology that we pieced together. It was individually developed, stovepiped, kind of proprietary, and right now we have 57 different terrain formats. So if we need to train, we have all these different formats that we're spending all our time trying to line up. And we see the synthetic training environment able to overcome all of that because it is a holistic strategy starting from the beginning with common data, common terrain, common standards, open architecture, and also starting it from the beginning, and we're thinking about how to train in the beginning versus thinking of training at the end and trying to piece it together. So long answer to your question. So I'll be quiet now and let somebody else answer.
Oh, thank you, ma'am. I'm going to go down to the end of the table for General Schloesser. Jeff, the next question's to you. When we see the Army and Army aviation enterprise shifting from wide area security and COIN focus to focus on large-scale combat operations, from your perspective as the 101st Airborne Division Commander in Afghanistan and as the ADC in support of the 2003 and 4 Iraq operations, as well as your industry experience, how do you think industry can help the Army, and specifically Army Aviation, affect this change in focus from a training and leader preparation perspective?
Yeah, thanks, Lon, for a good question. Well, I think, first of all, I think the Army and the services need to be upfront with industry and say, don't you dare bring us anything else in the future that doesn't have embedded training built into a system. And that's at the individual level, and potentially could move it up to even the small unit level, the squad or the crew level. So in other words, a product, a ground combat vehicle, and an aircraft, a capability out there, you would have to be able to take it and not just have a legacy embedded system. In other words, it's legacy the minute it gets fielded to you, but something that could be upgraded every time that there's a change, either in the enemy actions or potential enemy actions, or in your own capability, and so you could upgrade that. So first and foremost, the products need to have embedded training in them. And we're starting to do that already in some of the more sophisticated systems. I would say the other part of the individual part of this is to use augmented reality. And John Gervais talked about this and touched upon this, but there's no doubt that augmented reality, if you take just anything, for an example, the tasker this morning is to get to maintenance-free, zero maintenance, as General Gabriel would say, or near zero maintenance. So what does that mean if you're a tanker? I mean, how many times do you change the pack, if the engine pack? Well, you need to do it through augmented reality, and you learn through that, and then you get your reps through that, and then you have an automated logbook that actually becomes the skill book of the future. That can walk you through that, and potentially, industry's already using this, where we have virtual FSRs, where you have augmented reality, and you can actually dial up on, while you have augmented reality on, you can get a FSR or a systems engineer to say, you're doing it the wrong way, let me just show you how to do this, and they get engaged at the same time. So those are things at the individual level that I think are absolutely critical, and you'll see those as long as the Army holds firm on its set of requirements. My two biggest concerns are really in the unit level where warfighting gets really done. In other words, platoon and the company is how do you do, and I know General Gervais working this, and so is Colonel Ferrell, is how do you train teams of teams to accomplish a mission on a very complex battlefield, a multi-domain battlefield where it's not just you fighting force on force, but you have cyber, you have space effects, you have all those types of things. And that environment, I think, is something that industry still needs to explore better. We need to know what the Army and the service requirements are. But that is, again, still solvable. All of our experiences of whether it's essentially playing like laser tag or something like that, but you can work your way into a force on force that is extremely complex at our NTCs and in places of that nature at the brigade and below. My biggest fear is that what we're not training, and General Thurman kind of brought this up, is we're not training general officers and colonels and senior warrant officers, senior command sergeants major to run large-scale combat operations. That's not something that gets solved immediately with a augmented reality. Put this on, and General, you're going to learn how to fight a corps. We haven't fought a corps in decades. How about an army, theater army? How do you synchronize divisions on a battlefield in a very dense area with a lot of different attributes out there? And that's my biggest concern. And, I was sitting out in the audience, and I was thinking about, well, what should we be expected as industry to provide? One of the things we could do is we could work through artificial intelligence so that the process of perception, understanding, decide, and then assess. That's what a commander does on the battlefield. At least that's what I did in Afghanistan and Iraq. How do we help that with artificial intelligence? And how do we get to decide as quickly as possible? And then how many things do you have to decide as a commander or as a subordinate commander or as a staff? What can be taken off and done automatically? So I think there's a lot of potential for the future, but I think that in the large category, divisions and above, I think we are just nipping and just not even gotten at the tip of the iceberg. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Colonel Ryan, what changes are being made to Army aviation doctrine and training manuals to reflect the shift in large-scale combat operations?
Thanks, sir. Thanks for the question, and good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here with you. So we are revising doctrine as we speak down there at Fort Rucker, starting with obviously the capstone manual, the 304, and then other manuals that follow. And of course, we're doing that certainly to bring them in line, to make them relevant, nested with LSCO, and then as MDO concepts continue on. So we're working hard to do that down there at Fort Rucker, and to make sure that our organizations have, the required changes to how we're going to train and warfight. And I would say there's a couple notes I took from General Thurman's, the earlier panel that he was on, talking about that we have doctrine from, back in the day that is still useful now. So for example, in the attack world, the FM 1-112, was a great doctrinal manual that has a lot of great things in it in terms of preparation, planning, and execution of attack helicopter operations. So as we look at the 304 and then the .1, which is kind of the how-to manual, a TTP manual, if you will, we're looking back at some of those pieces. And the other part I would say is the keeping it simple part, I think, is very important too. So the .1, which is going to be kind of the how-to manual for company commanders and platoon leaders, to go to look at, executing basically their standardized medal, the core competencies of, what are those key collective and key leader tasks that Lieutenant Ryan, needs to understand and be able to go through the operations process, TLPs, of preparation activities or planning activities, preparation activities, and then execution to be successful. That then also kind of tied to your TE&Os and those things. So our young company commanders and platoon leaders out there have a how-to manual to go to look at doing some of these manuals. Probably for some out there that might remind you of the old RTEP kind of manuals. But either way, there's plenty of good doctrine that we've had before that we're bringing and putting into some of these manuals now. That's just one example of the 112. We're also kind of changing some of the survivability pieces. So the .2, which is kind of a high side manual for maneuvers and things like that we're going to push out to the field here shortly. And then living doctrine. So this is something that we're going to get at here in the future based on certainly some guidance from CAC and what we need to do for our formations out there. So all these things will support ongoing MDO concepts, LSCO, as this branches out, and we can get into this a little bit later on the training side in terms of aircrew training manuals, the .11, training support packages, things like that that we're doing within the branch to provide our warfighting units out there to be successful and develop good training at the individual and collective level. And I'll stop there, sir.
Thank you. And if I fail to mention, this is going to be an audience participation panel. So I got two more questions. If I don't have questions, I'm gonna use my telekinetic powers like Carrie, and I'm gonna shut the door and lock it until a question comes up here. So be thinking about what you'd like to ask these panelists. So Colonel Ferrell, what are the key challenges for creating simulation exercises that stress leaders in large-scale combat operations environment?
Well, thanks, sir. Again, thanks for letting me speak on the panel. It's an honor to be here among these esteemed colleagues. Yeah, so I have a laundry list of challenges. I'm just going to talk about a few of them that I think are on top of the plate right now. And we've talked about this before in several training venues. And the first one, I think, is time. If we look at training doctrine and how you go about planning and preparing to execute a training event, we have made that cycle so fast that I think leaders find themselves in a position where they just have to show up to the right place, right time, right uniform, and get trained. Our leaders, from what I'm seeing, at captains in the captain's career course who come through my facility every day, they don't understand the training process. They don't understand how to run a training meeting. Simple things like that of the process of training, because of our constrained timelines, is just making it difficult to get at some of the larger training objectives that you're trying to achieve on a collective environment. So that's time for the planning and prepare side, but also time in the execute phase. I talked to a couple units. We talk about AVCAT, obviously. As a Sims guy, people come to me to talk about that. And I've talked to units, and they say, yeah, we get one AVCAT event every 6 months. And they go there, they perform one mission, and they check the block, and they've moved on. When we send soldiers to a range, we send them there all day. They fire 300 some rounds plus till they're proficient, and then they move off the range. I don't know why we don't do that with our simulation training. We have the ability to stop and restart at the point of failure multiple times. So I don't know why we're not doing that with our exercises. We should do more repetitions in a given training period, as opposed to you don't send someone to a range, fire 5 rounds, a week later fire 5 rounds, a week later fire 5 rounds. You stay on the range until you get it right. And I think a simulation environment should be considered the same way. So that's another time thing. I think we should, if we're going to have a simulation event, let's keep doing it. Let's get those repetitions all in a short window so we can learn, retrain, learn, retrain, learn, retrain. That was it. Okay, so another challenge I think that I see a lot is complexity. How do we ramp up the complexity and intensity of an exercise while it's being executed until a staff or commander breaks? We do PT, we do muscle failure sessions where it's not about the number of reps, it's not about the time. You just keep going till you can't do no more. So why not develop exercises and stress the staff to a point where they can no longer function, and then ramp it down a bit, do an AER, do some lessons learned, and then pick it back up. Part of that, I think, having been through several exercises as a simulations guy as well as on the battle staff side, the training objectives. Probably the most important thing for any exercise or any training event is the commander's training objectives. What are those objectives you're trying to get to? So those are extremely important. However, the number one limiting factor for training exercise are the commander's training objectives. I don't know how many times I've tried to ramp up intensity to stress the staff, to get them to think about things differently, when I was told, well, no, if you do that, then I won't be able to get at this training objective. So I basically just constrained my exercise down to keep it too simple, to the point that, you know, it's a guaranteed win for the staff that they've gone through the process, but they didn't really learn a whole lot because all they're doing is executing, you know, staff muscle memory at that point. So that's just one of my things. So I think training objectives are important, but we also, one level up, commanders should have some say on how to ramp up the intensity to get past those training objectives. And the last thing is for the complexity side is sustainment. I don't see us. We don't exercise sustainment well enough in exercises, and I think hopefully with the new models and simulations coming on board with the STE, we'll be able to exercise those parts of training in our exercises a little bit more effectively, and that's going to be extremely important as we move into LSCO. Okay, so the last thing of the three things I wanted to talk about of the main challenges is the experience gap. We kind of talked about this a little bit at lunch, or just before lunch, and the guys you see sitting up here are the guys that grew up with multi-domain operations, 80s style, 90s style, and then we had OIF-1, that was the last time we did it. Kids training today, their entire experience base is COIN. We're trying to transition down at the schoolhouse, and so we're using G27 developed date scenarios to develop the training exercises for our captains and NCOs. We train NCOs in their talks as well. And we're noticing that the captains that are the trainers for the younger captains in the captain's career course don't have any experience in LSCO or major combat operations for that matter. So how do we overcome that gap? Training the trainers, we try to run them through some, crash course before they become SGLs, but they don't have it. Having the knowledge is different than having the experience and having done it several times like we did when we were younger. So I think that's a challenge. I don't have an answer for that right now, but it's definitely something we need to address here in the next few years. Otherwise, the guys on this panel that are going to be up and out won't be around to provide that experiential learning to those guys. That's it.
Thank you, sir. My last moderator question is going to go to the Chief Warrant Officer of the branch, Joe Roland, and then Ms. Roland, if you would, after you answer the moderator question, could you please answer the first audience question? My question to you, sir, is what is the aviation branch doing to ensure our warrant officers are trained and developed in the execution of LSCO?
Sir, I appreciate the question, and I appreciate it's an honor to be here, to be on this panel today. A couple things I want to clean up before I get to the question. One of them was asked of the boss earlier about the relationship between the SOAR and the conventional forces. So I've spent the last couple months embedded with them on and off during some of the QRTs and some of the other exercises they're doing out at China Lake. And right now it's completely open kimono. Many of the things that we're bringing into the conventional side are coming from the Special Operations Forces on how they train, how they plan, so on and so forth. So just from a warrant officer perspective, that relationship hasn't been any better in the recent past. The shortage of warrant officers, that question was brought up earlier. It's true, but we're getting at the accessions piece. The one thing I'll say for General Gaylor, he has owned the fact that we're the branch, and we couldn't just leave it up to USAREC to go out and recruit people to come into our branch. We know better than anybody who needs to be an aviation warfighter as a warrant officer. So we're actively participating in that right now, going into colleges and universities. General Mangum told me when I was on the HADF panel that if I started poaching young lieutenants, he would murder me. But you know, when I show them a cool video from the 160th or the conventional side and say, you want to do this, which is my PowerPoint presentation, or this, which is flying a helicopter, that's usually a pretty good draw to come over to the aviation cohort. And we've been successful, sir, in grabbing a few of the folks out of there. In North Georgia, I don't know where the boss is right now, but that's a primo hunting ground right now for aviation warrant officers. So he's earned his recruiting badge as of last year, brought like 15 people into our branch. To get at what we talked about earlier about PME and how we're going to close the gap for the aviation warrant officers. The first thing, somebody brought it up earlier, and I was going to talk about it anyway, but not everything's a material solution. So one of the senior leaders this morning said our soldiers are our most important capability, and that couldn't be any truer. You know, if we have a piece of kit, our enemy can figure out a way to defeat that piece of kit. And they do it on a regular basis, and this is why we kind of went to an aviation warfighting initiative. The one thing they have a hard time is trying to defeat that young man or woman, that soldier that's properly trained, that's innovative and adaptive. There's not a piece of equipment out there that they've designed yet that can defeat that. So that's why this panel is important, but overall our leader development is key to the success of the Army. So what are we doing? We looked at our PME as one of the things. We looked at both Aviation Warrant Officer Advanced Course, which we own at Fort Rucker, Warrant Officer Intermediate Level Education, which is the career college, and also the senior level education. For the advanced course, we went to a 9-week model. It gets into track specific. We get them in the simulation now, and it is all about getting back to the basics. It's great if we can write a white paper, but we should probably understand how to write an order, read an order, and understand an order first. The tip of the spear for our branch and for the Army is going to be that young captain and a young W2 or W3. We're going to be displaced in the next war. We're not going to be consolidated a giant fob with a brigade headquarters and a brigade commander talking right down to you or walking down to your talk and telling you what he or she wants you to be doing. So we've got to get at that group, and that's what we're doing right now. Flight school's changed. We're getting back to kind of flying in the dirt a little bit, understanding low level, the discipline to fly low level, when you need to do it, and then actually flying an aircraft. All our modern aircraft will fly themselves better than we can fly them. But we're not going to do an IFR flight plan into Syria, Russia, China, or any place else. So we got to learn how to fly that. The very first thing that our enemy will probably shut off is our GPS. So it would probably be pretty good for our aviators to understand how to read a map, right? Because we're still going to be expected to operate in a degraded environment. So those easy things to degrade, we're trying to get back into flight school, IPC, the instructor pilot course, teaching our trainers how to train those basic level tenets of being an aviator. Let's aviate first, and if we have all the great equipment and all the technology, that's a bonus. But we got to be able to win and fight with all that stuff degraded. We got to be able to do a mission without talking on the radio nonstop. So these are the things that we're introducing into the advanced course. Like I said, IPC, Our biggest course change is going to be our AMSO course, which will soon be the Tactical Operations course. So our young men and women that are coming through that are going to get specifically trained on how mission survivability, mission planning, it's completely different now. So in 2022, we've asked for the course growth, but we're going to actually produce some evaluators that come out of that can teach those tactics required to survive on the battlefield, that understand mission planning. Last year when I came back from a QRT and then I came back from another site visit, the first thing I told General Gaylor was, we're absolutely survivable on the battlefield, but it's going to require a different level of training. All right, it's a different mindset to do it. 90% of the survivability is mission planning. There's a lot of joint assets out there that help with that the regiment does a great job of tapping into, that we're now funneling back into the conventional side. So we know how to get to that. We produced our first SOP, one SOP. A lot of that was, let's just have joint terms. That was the craziest thing when I was growing up. It seemed like every commander I had or every SP I had defined his or her success on what kind of brevity word they could come up with. So if it was Screaming Eagle, Smashed Monkey, whatever it was something different. And none of our joint brothers and sisters understood what the hell we were talking about. So this environment requires us to be able to speak in that language that's common, and that's where we brought that into PME also. Low-level TSP, it's about ready to hit the street. It is a guide on how to actually execute those tasks that are going to be required on the future battlefield. And we can lead, like the boss talks about all the time, we can lead them to the water. I don't know if we're going to be able to make them drink it, but we've literally laid out a complete training program to get from the crawl stage to a run stage for large-scale combat operations. And again, I'll talk a little bit about the Aviation Warfighting Initiative. So that started off as defrag the hard drive, which was, hey, we got a bunch of data that we really don't need to know about, but it's bigger than that. That's just one component of a strategy that General Gaylor put together 2 years ago, which is the Aviation Warfighting Initiative. And that covers all of the above. It covers, if I don't understand the 7 fundamentals of the aviation branch or what I need to do or fundamentals of reconnaissance or doctrine, then I probably don't need to be able to draw an eyeball just yet. If I'm smart enough, maybe I'll figure out the eyeball later. But right now, those life-taking and life-saving skills required of a warfighter, we're going to put those up front, make them learn it, make them understand it, and execute it. And if there's time left over, there's other stuff in this branch that we can get at. But we've got to be good at that. We can't say we're ready to fight tonight if I don't understand doctrine, but I can draw the anatomy of the eye. Or the boss's favorite, the lift equation, which he can do because he's been doing it for quite a long time. All right, so that's kind of what we're doing for the aviation warrant officer, warfighter, how we're integrating large-scale combat operations in every level. So everything from flight school to all our PMEs. There'll be follow-on PMEs for ILE and SSC, and I'll talk a little bit about that because that kind of leads, it's a good segue into the question that was posed. Future battlefield will be more complex. Demands on air crews will increase. In multi-domain operations, aircraft will be more technical. How will aviation transform how it assesses warrant officers and develops senior warrant officers? So I'm going to go back to aircraft will be more technical. As we grow, the future vertical lift aircraft, if it is so complicated that we spend all our time trying to fly it and not fight it, then we have failed as an Army to get the right aircraft. Much of the stuff we do should be intuitive. And as a Sikorsky guy myself, when I stepped into or sat in an Apache and went out, and first time I shot gunnery in an Apache and I went into the FARP, for me, and in a Black Hawk, it's 4 different pages I got to go through to configure my aircraft to take hot refuel. In an Apache, it was 1 button push. We got to get to the 1 button push. Right? If I want to load a radio, it should know that there's 15 steps to it. Well, the computers on board do all the 15 steps. So I just hit the button and say, load the radio. I've got to open up the aperture a little bit. I got to be able to look outside my aircraft, look 15, 20 kilometers out in front of my aircraft and not worried about the aircraft itself. It should be able to stay in the air kind of on its own and let me work sensors and look out forward and fly it when required. But it shouldn't be so complex that I spend 90% of my time flying it. That's something I think for the audience that would I know that we're looking for in the future aircraft that we're getting ready to get. So how are we going to develop senior warrant officers? The difference between aviation senior warrant officers and those in other branches, our senior warrant officers are expected to be war fighters. So we're not going to off-ramp them and spend 3 weeks talking about joint operations, because we don't put them there for the most part. There's really no senior aviation warrant officer position in joint headquarters right now. But we're going to teach them, regreen them on tactics, how to integrate into a joint fight, right? Because they're the ones, along with brigade commanders and battalion commanders, that have the influence to set training events, so that we do go out and train the stuff that we need to train to get at this next warfare. So ILE follow-on is kind of set up for battalion level. Our SSE follow-on is set up for the brigade level, and they're right now basically they're about 3 weeks in duration. So you go to the career college course, and you'll spend an extra 3 weeks at Fort Rucker just doing nothing but aviation-specific senior warrant officer requirements, and that's how we're going to develop them. And then those people that rise to the top, the ones that can speak well and can write well, will maybe have something else to do after that. But other than that, we really got to focus on producing our senior warrant officers to be war fighters and not looking at other positions out there. We're trying to recoup some of those positions that we've put out into the force to make sure that our operational commands actually have the senior warrant officers with the experience embedded in the cabs, and not somewhere else where they're like in the futures command or the futures development or something like that. We still have a requirement for those, but for the most part, we want to keep our war fighters in our warfighting units. So that's it.
Thank you, Mr. Roland. We have a question from our live stream from Huntsville, and I'm going to ask General Gervais to answer that for us.
So thanks. So the question is, can you clarify what you meant when you said 57 different terrain formats? Let me take a little bit of time just to kind of explain why we have these different 57 terrain formats. So as I mentioned earlier, we developed our current tactical trainers, our AVCAT and our close combat tactical trainer, our current simulators that we have on hand, 80s, 90s technology, independently developed proprietary information. And because of this, all of these different simulators use terrain differently. And so every time we have a new version that comes out, we get a new terrain format. And so what we end up having to do is spend a lot of time. For example, when we want to hook them together, we spend a lot of time getting these different simulators to use the terrain the same. And for example, we tried to bring an air defense capability into the AVCAT. Because that ADA capability used terrain differently, what had occurred is, here's the helicopter flying behind the hill. The ADA capability didn't see the hill and was shooting straight through the hill, taking down the helicopter. And so we were trying to figure out good TTPs being used, but the fact is these two different versions use terrain differently because the game engine was different in them that made it work. And so what we've seen is that it makes it very difficult, and it depends on where you are, either CONUS or OCONUS. So a real example, we had the brigade combat team that from Fort Riley was doing their train up. They were en route to NTC, so they did their train up, went to NTC, they're prepared to go take the RAF mission in Europe. But after they put their equipment on the ship, they had the ability now to do some training. The challenge we had was that they only had local terrain in their simulators, in their simulation capability. So we had to reach all the way over to Germany, say, can we get your terrain database? Snail mailed it over, and then that mission training complex took about 2.5, 3 months to get it to work in their simulators. So it's not responsive at all. And plus, we have challenges for what is used from our collective trainers to also what we can do from a constructive, the large-scale warfighter exercises. In December 15, General Milley said, I want 10 different terrain formats so I can give this problem set to our commanders and change the location. Today, because of just the complexity of it right now. We've only delivered 3 out of what he wanted 10, and it just takes time to build. It's costly, and then we have to come in and put the date from the G2 27 perspective on top of that, and then we have to do the scenario for a warfighter. So what we envision as part of the synthetic training environment is what we call one world terrain. And so I just want you to envision Google Earth, a globe, and there's lots of, you would think we've been in places mapping terrain all along, right? But the challenge we have is being able to collect it and bring it into a 3D simulator and make it game engine agnostic. And so what we've been working on is this one world terrain, so that we will have terrain wherever it is, whatever the terrain data, being able to bring it into what we're calling the STE World server and turn it into a commercial game engine language that's recognized and used by everybody, and then it doesn't matter what game engine you have in there, and it will work in your virtual collective simulators, and it will also be able to go into Constructive. So our vision, and what the chief has challenged me to do over the next 2 years, is he would like to go, we need to do a division warfighter to get after large-scale combat operations. And he wants to be able to go, I want to go here. And he wants to be able to pull that terrain down, put it right into our simulators all the way from the squad to our collective trainers, and then take that and put it into our Constructive simulators. He wants to do that in 7 days, so that we can give a division or corps 7 days versus the 120 to 180 days it takes us to plan a Constructive level exercise and make all of this work. And the reason we're having this challenge is because we don't have common data, common terrain, and open architecture, and standards. And what we want to do with STE is get the back end of it right, so that it's immaterial to a commander that wants to train. They can go, we're going here, pull it down, and be able to do it. And that's the simplistic version of it, and we're already demonstrating some level of this capability already. And so to me, that's probably the most exciting thing, because that will be the most responsive to a commander in the field, to have the terrain that they would actually have to go fight, or if they're going on some other mission, to be able to pull that down and have it at the fidelity necessary to train on. If I had to say there's the one thing which I think is our Achilles heel in the training, it is, no kidding, the terrain piece of that, because we are very challenged to have, no kidding, a terrain capability that's immersive in our simulators, and it's consistent all the way from the squad all the way up. So that's what I meant by 57 different terrain formats.
Sir, can I jump
Yes,
on that
you
real
can.
quick?
Yes.
So I agree with having the correct train, but we also got to get to the point where our simulators are fully integrated. I mean, we're right now great going to a QRT or China Lake and defeating the one system that sits out there, but that's not how the enemy is going to fight. So how do we incorporate all the integration piece for what our near-peer competitors have right now? If I trip this wire, it's going to set off these things, because that's when we're developing our junior leaders right now. We want to exploit a gap or something like that. They've got to be able to see that. So shooting through the mountain, absolutely, that drives me crazy in the AVCAT right now, even when our aviators are doing the right thing and they're still getting shot down. But what happens, it's not just one piece of equipment that's going to be on the battlefield. It's going to be an array of equipment. And how do they work their way through that complex problem to get to the other side in one piece? Absolutely.
Colonel Ferrell, I think you have a question from the audience.
Okay, so I was given a question regarding our allied partners. So with regards to enhancing STE, have we learned of any valuable TTPs from our allied partners? Kind of a broad question, but I can tell you this. Before I came to Director of Simulations, I was NATO Modeling Simulation Center in Rome. And what we looked at was, how does the alliance, NATO specifically, employ models and simulations from operational support to training to experimentation, you name it. And one of the things that NATO does, and they do very well, is they They get together, they establish standards, they agree upon those standards, and when I talk about standards, I'm talking about the technical interoperability standards between systems. They agree on those, and every country then, when they develop whatever simulation, they build them to those standards. So we talk about the common backbone in the NATO environment. It's like that. I did have a conversation with one of the senior managers of modeling simulation in NATO, and he mentioned, yeah, the American idea of interoperability is very different than the European idea. And I said, well, how is that? He says, well, the American idea of interoperability is you guys build something, and then you want us all to, pile in on whatever it is you guys built. Whereas in the NATO, the NATO version of that is they all agree upon a standard, and then they all build to that standard first. So I think that's the big difference, and I think that is a learning point. So the bottom line is you got to start from the ground up. So as we're going through the FVL and all these other combat systems, we're looking at that common network architecture that they're all going to ride on. It's not going to be, interoperability will be a thing of a past because it's going to be automatically built into the system if we use common standards and databases, and we all agree on all that going forward. Right now, it's still a challenge. It's going to remain a challenge for the foreseeable future with our current combat platforms and training systems for years to come. So I think the biggest TTP takeaway from our allied partners is the fact that they got interoperability right from a technical standpoint. We just haven't got on board. They have the standards, we sign on to those standards, but then we don't really follow them. And that's not just the Army, that's DoD across the board, so that's it.
Yes, so I'll jump on a little bit of this since it started with the synthetic training environment. But before I do that, I'm just going to echo a couple things. Having just experienced trying to bring in one of our allied partners into our Warfighter 18-4, which we just finished up. So we had a 3rd UK division that came into our Warfighter exercise. 17-5, we did not do it very well. 17-5, we were doing swivel chair operations. An order took about 8 hours to burn, get through the whole foreign disclosure piece of it, and then we handed it off to them. And there was lots of other challenges that was with it. So as we came out of 17-5, we put together a working group and pulled across the entire Army to improve interoperability for Warfighter 18-4. And I will just say it like this. 21 general officers, 12 months, putting solutions in place so it could be seamless for 18-4 for a training environment, because we established a mission partner environment. And the level of effort that we had to put into that exercise for a UK division to be part of a training audience, although, everybody said it went off perfectly, that level of effort is just too much. And we have got to get after how do we create those common standards, the open architecture, and then start with multinational or interoperability in mind in the forefront. So, the department level is leading a multinational interoperability, looking at everything across the board and determining at what level do we need to be interoperable and at what. And so we, the 18-4 kind of paved the way for some of that discussion, but we got a long way to go. Because what we see in the simulations piece right now is, as we go over to Europe, a lot of our partners over there have bought, our system, so it's interoperable, but it's only from the East. When you go to the West, they're all on something different. So we have, and then when you go to the Asia Pacific, it's all different. So what we have to do is figure out how do we get to that common standard so that we can be interoperable and not always trying to put a bridge in place, which takes time and money and is not responsive. And so we're working very hard on that. And that's why when we look at synthetic training environment, we're really trying to drive from a holistic standpoint those common standards, the data, the terrain, and the goodness is our partners have already been engaging us on what it is that we're doing. And we've taken a look at some of the capability they have that they've already opened. And we're looking at how can that inform what we're doing in the synthetic training environment. And so we're keeping that linkage so that what we don't do is, as we're moving to the synthetic training environment, we preclude ourselves or exclude some capability that we know we're going to have to be interoperable with. And, you know, building on an open architecture, to me, is one of the most important things that we can do. Because the open architecture will allow, it'll be just like your iPhone. I mean, the iPhone, you can pull it out. It doesn't matter. You go to iPhone 10, it's there. The challenge we have right now is when we try to go to, you know, the next step, we've already have a black box or something, a decision that we've made that won't allow us to go to the next step. So what we're trying to do is take the same approach, open architecture, and then what that will allow us to do is have the flexibility, the plug and play, and also evolve with technology and give us a lot more flexibility than we have right now. Okay, so now I got the next question. So sorry, you got to listen to me a little bit more. What is being done to transform our training centers, NTC, JRTC, and we're also focused on JMRC, that allows soldiers to train in multi-domain contested battlefield? And that is a great question, because, you know, we started off with the question to me is, you know, large-scale combat operations and multi-domain operations. And I kind of explained to you that if you look at our current training environment, I mean, we are very limited in where we are able to train in terms of a live, virtual, and constructive environment. Additionally, you know, we cannot do all war fighting functions. And so what I'm very focused on with the STE, and why I think we have such a great opportunity here, especially in the next 3 to 5 years, as STE is a cross-functional team aligned under soldier lethality as one of the 6 modernization priorities, is we have the ability now to really provide, one, a home station training capability, because, you know, our limitations of our ranges, our installations, the sophistication of our weapons that are exceeding our capability to train, we will be able to replicate that operational environment. We will be able to, no kidding, at home station training, be able to do a combined arms, bring all the enablers in that we've had trouble or challenges with the instrumentation piece of that at home station. But on top of that, multi-domain operations. We are already talking to our Air Force counterparts, our Marine counterparts. They sit on the CFT. We're engaging at the OSD level, because we are trying, first of all, to get common terrain. We're also trying to get the common data, the common standards, because if we can get the back end of this right, then we know we can train all of our systems. And if you think about multi-domain operations and what we're trying to achieve with that, the one place we're going to be able to bring it all to bear is in a synthetic training environment. And if you think about mega cities, we can put all the physical infrastructure out there that we can, but where can we replicate, no kidding, a mega city with its patterns of life and the role players necessary? So at our CTCs right now, I mean, we are bringing in just some of those other domains. I talked to IADS already, and NTC is actually expanding their capabilities, so they're going back to China Lake as we did previously to do that. The EW Cyber and Space, we are bringing in those capabilities right now so that we can integrate those into the rotational units. And then on top of that, the Air Force is now working with us, because they want to expand their corridors and compete in a competitive, create a more competitive environment at some of the CTCs. So we have the opportunity now to use some of their live emitters that they're developing, that the cost has went down, and take advantage of some joint funding from that perspective to bring them into our CTCs. So we are looking at this heavily and making the changes, not just to the capability that the OPFOR has, but also improving the manning for our operations group and all of some of the other enablers that we have to bring in from a planning perspective, information ops, EW, cyber, and bringing people to experts on the ground to train that, OC it, and actually present that to the training audience to drive that change. So hopefully that answered your question.
Thank you. Mr. Roland.
Okay, is today's cockpit completely paperless, electronic checklists and maps, and how's that working out? So yes and no. I mean, we still have the checklists that are required in the aircraft, but everything else is paperless. So, and it works really good when I'm cruising around Fort Rucker, Alabama, or going down to the coast, and I got my maps and I got SA on all the civilian aircraft out there. How it's going to work in a contested environment, I don't know if we've tested that. where what's going to happen when an EMP goes off or they shut this off. I will tell you that the battery life on these kits probably needs to be improved, and the ability to quick charge it needs to be improved. Just from my personal experience using this piece of kit on a regular basis when I'm flying. It's nice to lay out everything you got for the day, but I did a test with some of the IPs at Fort Rucker, and I said, if I had a mission packet and I showed you a GRG and you were on a different page on your iPad, I can get to my page quicker than you can get to your page on that iPad by just pulling the piece of paper out and showing it to you. So there's probably going to be some goodness in having, obviously, a backup. You don't want to be going to the X and all of a sudden your electronic kneeboard quits working. You know, I want to have a piece of paper as a flight lead to get there. So, but it's working right now. It needs some improvements probably in battery life and, like I said, charging. That's just Joe Roland's perspective. And I don't think we've tested it to the point where it's gone up against anything that our enemy may pose to us to shut down that piece of kit. I mean, I fully expected my Mike model Blackhawk to be flying with 4 blue screens of death. But my expectation is I can still get to my objective, because the one thing the enemy hasn't figured out how to spoof is natural terrain features. You can't move the mountain. I can still look out forward and say I should know where I am and how to get to my objective. So there's use for both paper and the electronic piece. So we slowly integrated that into the branch. Yeah.
Okay, we have about 12 minutes left. What I'd like to do is have a question at large, and maybe get a couple of you to comment on this. General Schloesser, maybe you could field this question first. It's to the panel. It says, Colonel Ferrell mentioned, don't you love it when they start out by saying something you said? That's great. But you said, you mentioned that training has been delivered as a commodity by contractors over the past 10 to 15 years, largely due to R4Gen demands. So here's a question. How do we get training back into the commander's responsibility?
Good job. Well, that's a great question. I mean, and I think, we've already talked about it. First and foremost is you got to get all the way back and have platoon leaders and company commanders know how to run a training meeting. So that's the first and foremost. So those are the basics right there. And then, as leadership grows up, you essentially have to make sure that we don't abandon that and then pass it off so that you just have to show up at the CTCs. Because I mean, the biggest fear is, as I'm hearing it being laid out, is that we could easily get to a mixed and synthetic training environment that would actually bring in the old war fighters of the past, but also stress the units that are going to be the action units, whether it's the BCT at NTC or something like that, and then all the other maneuver components, such as aviation and cyber and stuff like that, but it could be all laid out for you. So you still end up, because it's so darn complex, you don't have the time to plan it, and you just show up to it. And that's going to be, I think, the biggest stressor, because I'm in the industry, U.S. industry, to help you do this, and in the sense we already have, they'll come up with ways to do it so that you do show up, whether it's at JRTC, NTC, and it won't become as you are, but there'll be some things that you'll have to do, but they will do the training piece for you. And in a sense, in other words, you'll just go and experience it. And that's what we can't get back to. Somehow we've got to be involved from the start, down from the training NCO all the way up. And I don't know if I have any solutions, but it's going to take everybody staying involved.
Anyone else?
You probably have an answer, I would bet.
Good, okay. Sir, I agree. You start off by talking about getting back to company training meetings and things like that in terms of returning training to commander's hands. I wouldn't say it's ever left it. As someone that came out of Cab Command about 7-8 months ago that was on a rotational cycle, certainly it is a challenge and it is a skill set that we need to probably regain and relearn to the standard that we all know what that is for training meetings. I think it's especially important as we look to go to objective T types of evaluations too, where you know, the output of that company training meeting or that company training meeting is really the first step here in kind of building objective T-level readiness, because you're going to have to be organized and manage the time available to train of what METs, for example, is a unit going to train over the next 8 weeks or quarter. And it's going to have to be incredibly well organized to be able to get after all the METs and after all the components, obviously, that make up objective T, individual live fire, collective live fire, et cetera, et cetera. You know, leading up to culminating training events. And so this is something that I think we all got to get after out there across our formations. And really, from the CAB perspective, moving forward with objective T here is, you know, based on kind of what those standards are, including CALFEXs and things like that, the CABs now really, we certainly exist to support the ground force. You know, that's why we do what we do. And we do that in training, certainly for our divisional BCTs. But there is also a component now to the CABs being the support head unit for training as well. And getting other enablers, other warfighting functions at the right time and place across a divisional long-range training calendar, if you will, or core even, where you can reach those training milestones that obviously tie to objective T standards and overall readiness.
Hey, General Crutchfield, let me just pile on for one on this one. You know, what comes to my mind is that how complex this is actually just going to be. I mean, as I look at the new, it's not new doctrine, but as I look at the new explanation of the battlefield, aviation as a maneuver force is going to be involved in not only close contact, but then also what I understand is really kind of like the close maneuver area, then a deep maneuver area that's actually quite extended distance, and then into the deep fires area. And I'm probably tearing up the language that you're going to see one of these days. But all the way across the board, I mean, you know, the challenge is going to be is that every aircraft is out there as a sensor, collecting, may not be acting on everything, but at least being able to network it, bring it on back, and then help someone else choose whether they're going to either just catalog it, engage, or do whatever they're going to do. But it's going to be across this battlefield, or the depth of the battlefield is quite extensive. Anything considerably more than any of us as division commanders had to worry about in the last 20 years, or even before that. I mean, as a second lieutenant, I was in Germany, and, you know, my battlefield was pretty narrow sector there for my platoon. I think that that's going to be a huge challenge, and I'm not going to say that aviation is the only branch that is going to have those kinds of depth challenges. Clearly artillery and others, and certainly infantry and armor, but I mean, it's going to be a sporty event, and it's going to take an awful lot of capability, and it's going to take a lot of training to be able to do that.
Thank you, sir.
Sir, can I
go
pile
ahead.
on that real quick as a trainer myself? So, yeah, that's probably one of the biggest concerns from the aviation branch is the trainers themselves. We've got to, train the trainer to a standard to ensure that they can turn around and train the rest of the force, and we're quickly running out of people that understand how to do that. So one of the, you know, obviously agree with your boss. The boss said that, obviously pump them up when required, I guess, but the one of the things we did, right, so for the low-level TSP, actually he didn't like it initially because he's stands an instructor himself with a lot of experience, but we wrote that TSP specifically for our trainers in our aviation branch so that they could turn around and take that and teach it the right way. Right, so we got to do a little bit more of that too. I mean, we everything from the young captain, I know the DC spends a lot of time down there at the captain's career course. They're side by side, the Warrant Officer Advanced course and the captain's career course, and it's the tip of the spear, and you toss a doctrinal term in there and you kind of walk out going, oh crap, we got some work to do, right? Because they have to know it, and we've got to figure out how to recapitalize that experience that's out there, bring them back in to teach, L&O, mentor, because we're sorely lacking in that right now. It's not that they don't have the capability to do it, they just don't know what right looks like. We changed IPC. We were training Fort Rucker IPs at Fort Rucker and sending them back out to the field. We're teaching warfighting IPs to send out to the field, and if you have to stay at Fort Rucker, ooh, you got a little bit more work to do. Like I had to live through that too. But those are some of the initiatives that we want to start. But again, it starts with making sure that the person doing the training event is properly trained. And that's not the case across the force right now.
All right, last pile on, promise. Okay, since my name was mentioned, I figured I had to go in on this one, and I didn't say contractors, I just said somebody else was doing the training. Just to be clear. Okay, so I absolutely 100% agree. Commanders own training of their formations, and it starts at the company command level and on up. And I think every commander above the level below, i.e. battalion commanders, should be looking at his company commanders and making sure that they're trained properly to train their formations, et cetera, et cetera. That being said, commanders need training too. And it goes back to the train the trainer thing. So we talked about the training meetings and getting them into that cycle, that repetition, that understanding of how to plan, prepare, execute, and assess training according to doctrine. Give them the time they need to train their formations. I talked about time up front. That's very important. So we can't just turn around and say, all right, Commander, it's on you, and then not give him the resources he needs to execute. So that is a big thing. So, but commanders do need training, and something you mentioned in General Schloesser in your opening comments was a commander's job on the battlefield is to perceive, understand, decide, and assess. 100% agree. And they only learn to do that by being immersed in that environment over and over and over. You take that 8 hours MDMP, IPB process and you compress that down. How do you do that? Well, you do that by having done it over and over, not as a process, but by understanding and recognizing the cues that are out there amongst all the information that's being presented to you on a daily basis. And that's a commander's role. And if he can't step back and look at the whole training picture, the whole combat picture, then we're just not giving them what they need to be successful. That's it.
Thanks. Well, look, we got about 2 minutes.
Yeah, can I jump in?
Yeah,
real
we
quick?
got 2 minutes left
Okay,
if you
good.
can.
So, I have listened to this and just kind of understanding, so we kind of have training management division up under CACT, and, we started with FM 7.0 because we recognized the fact that, we had to get back to the basics of training and understanding. But I think there's a couple things that we just, from ourselves, we need to think about. So number one, how do we reduce the burden that commanders have on them right now from some of the things that, have been placed on them in terms of mandatory training that is, kind of taking them away from where they really need to be, which is out training their soldiers. And then I think we have to get back to underwriting that risk. Underwriting risks that commanders, at all levels do to provide that space and that time that they need. Because I think some of those things have really kind of lent itself to complicating the challenge. And then as we come back and we talk about the basics, we have to make sure that as we're laying out the basics, to truly have that basic foundation to drive on. Because what currently we're seeing is that although it comes naturally to us, it is not well understood what we mean in terms of when we talk about unit training management, even as we talk about it in our professional military education. So understanding your comment about what the trainers, making sure they understand what right looks like. Sometimes we put a trainer who's doing observer and controlling has had one gunnery under their belt, and they're the ones that are observing the next gunnery. So I think, over time, we've just got to make sure that we understand where those shortfalls are, and then we are helping to shore those up and assuming some of that risk in training. Okay, I'll shut up now.
No, you're okay. Well, I do want to thank this panel for the discussion, and to just wrap it all up, leave you with one thought. My last job in the Army as Deputy Commander PACOM, we used to have CODELs that always come to Pacific Command, and I would show them this chart, and it has to do with similar to what we've been talking about. This chart showed China over the last 15 years and how they grew. And it showed the little red ships and planes, showed the little blue ships and planes, and the red ships and planes grew dramatically over the last 15 years. They outgunned us, they've outranged us, they've outnumbered us. So as the CODELs begin to wring their hands and get scared, I tell them this. I'd say there is one difference on this chart, and that is the United States soldier and how they're trained. That's what I told them, and that eased their minds. And so what the professionals in front of us today have been talking about is how do we continue to do that to maintain our edge on the future battlefield. Thank you all. General Swan, Sergeant Major, thank you for allowing me to be part of it today.
Thank you.